Thanks for taking your time out of your Sunday to come listen to some of the stories that I've collected over the course of this summer. And so I think I know most of you in this room, but my name's Gabe Andrews, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Vermont in the Field Naturalist program, and have been sort of tasked with this idea of garnishing this support for this identity, this sense of place within the New Haven River watershed. And you can read scientific articles and you can discuss opinions, but I think one of the strongest ways to really communicate that sense of place is through the art of storytelling. And so that's what I sought to do this summer, was to collect stories from people who have called this watershed home for 7 decades or more, or for just a couple of years. And through those stories, we begin to understand not only how we interact with the river, but also how the river interacts with us, and how that sort of shapes our identity. And so, sort of the playbook for today is, I'll start, since I think it's only fair that you know a piece of me, I'll give a brief story of how I got here and really became interested in this project, and then discuss a little bit about how the ancient history of this landscape has informed some of the things we see in these flooding events, and also just our interactions with the river and where we recreate or where we build our houses, both as individuals and as communities. So to start with, just to remind ourselves that it was only 5 years ago to this day that Tropical Storm Irene ripped across the state and throughout much of the Northeast. And ironically also 12 years ago to the same day that Bristol experienced a freshet that inundated the streets here, and instead of sedans and minivans, we had kayaks and canoes up and down Mountain Street. And so it's to sort of commemorate those events and to look into the future, knowing that this region of the country and in Vermont can expect not only increasing frequency of storms and of heavy rain events, but also in intensity. And so really evaluating how we want to approach that as a community and build resilience, but also in doing so protecting our resources in our lives. And so as I mentioned, I promised a little story about myself, and this will be short, and it ties into this idea of watershed, because maybe not everyone in here is familiar with what a watershed is. And so when I was a boy, I know this map, this aerial photo doesn't give you much context, but that's sort of the point. When I was a child, that was my context. I understood, in this picture you're seeing about 25 acres I understood the land and the water of this area that I grew up in. And I knew that rain would fall in the pond, and it would overflow into the ravine and find its way into the creek, which is what you see, that blue line in the north in that picture. And so that's what I understood. I understood that I could catch bluegill and catfish in my pond, and crayfish and largemouth bass in the creek. And then it all changed. I would go outside with excitement after 3 days of rain, because as many of us know, as a child and in summer, and consecutive days of rain usually brings some kind of muddied or wet adventure. But I was distraught to walk outside and be hit in the face with a really decaying aroma of dead fish, and so the bass and the crayfish that I knew were belly up in the floodplain, and turtles and catfish joined them. And it was then that I realized that my watershed was anything but this small patch of land, that it existed in the context of people upstream, and of course people downstream as well. And so that little rectangle, the little red rectangle you see in that picture is that same property, but now you can see with intense development to the north and to the south, that's a picture today that wasn't there 20 years ago. And then flanking all of the impervious surfaces, those developed areas, are a lot of farms. And so I found out that sometimes your little sanctuary, whether it be a pond or a woodlot, can be affected by what other people are doing on the landscape. And so that's when I sort of kind of grasped for the first time what a watershed was, and it really sort of ignited a little flame in my body at a young age to really be passionate about issues with water. And so that brings us to our watershed that we're here to talk about today. And you can look at watersheds at different scales. And so what is this concept of a watershed? You can just think of it as sort of the land that drains the rain from the skies and the water in the brooks. And you can look at it at different scales. So for an example, you could think about it in terms of maybe like a locker room shower. And so maybe you're thinking about a men's locker room, and so the water comes out of those shower heads and hits different physiques, we'll call it. And as it washes down those bodies, it picks up things, but it all ends up into one drain, right? So that's sort of a small-scale watershed that we can think about. And so in this picture on your left, that's the headwaters of the New Haven River. And so we can look at the landscapes within the New Haven headwaters and see how that informs the watershed. Of course, you could also broaden it out to the entire New Haven River watershed. So maybe instead of just the men's locker room, you think about the women's as well. And so this water's still leaving these different shower heads, but this time it's hitting different structures and different features and picking up different things and ending in that drain in the women's bathroom, which in turn joins the drain from the men's bathroom, and so it sort of has more input from a larger land area, so to speak. And so that's what we can think about in terms of the New Haven River watershed. And then you can continue to broaden that perspective. And so maybe it's the entire gym, but also the school down the street and the post office, all who have these drainage systems that ultimately end up into a water treatment plant. And maybe that's the Lake Champlain Basin. And hopefully that analogy does not go too far there, because we don't want to think of our watersheds in terms of water treatment centers, because we have come to realize that what we do on the land travels downstream. And as some of us know, we're seeing that within the basin. And so how do we define these boundaries, these watershed boundaries, these sort of amorphous constraints? And so, as many of you know from Bristol and New Haven and elsewhere, we're very tied to our town lines, right? So we associate with our communities based on these really artificial lines that were drawn centuries ago. But the watershed boundary encompasses much more than that. And it really has its foundation in events that happened close to about 500 million years ago. And then were really influenced more recently. But before we talk about that, just by a show of hands, and keep your hands up as I ask, who's from Bristol, or who lives in Bristol? New Haven? And keep your hands up, Bristol folks. Middlebury? Starksboro? Lincoln? This is our watershed community, right? So that we all come from different towns. These towns all drain into the same watershed. And you'll notice that if you think about like Mount Abe, we have a few teachers from Mount Abe here today, they're drawing kids from that same area, right? So these towns cross this, our students and our water crosses these town lines to join on sort of a watershed scale that we can think about and manage together. And so the way that it came to be and how we define these boundaries is based on the physical nature or the topography of our landscapes. And so some 440 million years ago, these continental landmasses collided with force that created the Green Mountains that if you look off into the east, you can see. And that legacy has been there for all these years, of course, eroding throughout time, but what we see today helps define part of that boundary. But it's really the more recent history, geologically speaking, of course, that I think ties into how we look at the watershed and how we inhabit the watershed. And so this is my favorite picture that I've found or created, whatever you want to call it, throughout this summer, is because if you know a little bit about the glacial history and you just look at this aerial photograph, you can infer a lot about what's going on with landscape uses and settlements in this region. And so to give you some context, that blue, or that dark blob kind of in the mid-upper section is Bristol Pond. And then you have south of there, south and west is New Haven, the town of New Haven, and then those lines represent that watershed boundary. So the blue line is the New Haven main stem watershed. The gray is the headwaters of the New Haven, and then and Baldwin Creek joins that with the green line in the north. And so looking at this picture, you can see, if you look sort of in the left third, where it goes from a dark green to a tan, it's sort of the line between Bristol Flats, Lincoln, and South Mountain. And it's not just a line in the physical landscape, but it's a line in the cultural landscape, it's a line in the glacial history landscape. And you can look at this picture and say, something happened here a long time ago, and that something describes what we see today. And so if we were to walk outside on say, the back lawn of Mount Abe High School, we might be looking at beachfront property to this pre-glacial Lake Vermont, so this massive body of water that filled the Champlain Valley. And as these glaciers were filling the valley and then retreating, creating this lake some 14,000 years ago, the rivers that ran into it created these deltas, in the same way that if you walk out to any mouth of a river, you can see a delta that consists of sort of those gravels and sands that are sorted really nicely. Well, it turns out that same kind of physical feature in the landscape is really good to build on, to develop on. And so much of Bristol is on top of what's known as the Cane Terrace, and it's that really sort of sorted and well-drained soils that are good to put septic tanks in or to build buildings on top of. And so, unfortunately, we're not on beachfront property any longer, but you can think about how these historic events really shaped how we occupy the lands. And on the flip side of that, if you look at New Haven and there's all this tan coloration, that's from that same time period. So when you had this massive lake that covered the valley, just think of like a cup of coffee. You have a cup of coffee and you let it sit, and you drink it, and it sits, and you drink it, and by the time you get done with it, there's some kind of fine grains at the bottom. The same thing with this lake. There's this deep lake with all these fine silts that settled down over time, and as they did, they were compacted into these clay soils that are extremely rich and valuable for agriculture. And that is really what makes up a large part of New Haven. You can see that in the orange there. And so I just want to, this is a surficial geology map. So this map looks at sort of what the glaciers did to the landscape. And so I just want you to look at that orange, which is that clay, that fine sediment that settled over a couple thousand years and formed these soils. But also this kind of deep, this dark purple that runs right through Bristol. And that is the Cane Terrace that I mentioned. And so you can sort of look at these two graphs, or these two images together, and see how these patterns and processes sort of come together. And the other two colors that I want you to pay attention to is the dark green and the lime green. So this is the same picture with our impervious surfaces built over top of it. And so not only did we decide where to build and how to build based on these underlying soils, right? So we built in New Haven, we built farms on these rich clay soils, but we also took advantage of the alluvial soils, so the soils that are a result of river processes. And so if you follow some of the rivers on the left that guide us through this glacial landscape, post-glacial landscape, and then you follow the roads on the right, they sort of align. And so it's like this intersection of our river history, but also of our glacial history that describes how we use the land. And that's always been the case. If you go back 3,000 years and look at early inhabitants of this area, would have utilized those same river corridors that we build roads on, that we build houses near, whether it's for recreation or resource. These objects in the landscape determined, in a large extent, how we settled. And so whether it was natives a couple thousand years ago or our early settlers who utilized these rich alluvial soils and highways of rivers to explore the landscape and to settle. We learn a lot just from looking at our soils and our patterns in our rivers. And so now that we have a little bit of understanding of how we look at watersheds, we can use that to listen to some of the stories that I've collected this summer and think about how if we're settling in places like the floodplain or along riverbanks, how that might in turn affect our vulnerability to flooding events, especially in the case where if we're building on a cane terrace or these soils that are really sandy or gravelly that might erode more easily in the event of a storm. And of course, this is just our legacy, right? I mean, these are people that came long before us and we followed in their footsteps. But we have a lot that I think that we can learn from them. So I'm going to turn it over to a few of our storytellers for a few moments.
And Gerald Taffer.
Margaret Carruthers.
Peter Carruthers.
My name is Susan Smiley. I live on the river and on the river road.
Tom Wallace, and resident of Bristol.
Hi there, my name is Ethan. I'm 67 now, and I've been a Bristol resident since 1973.
Paul Lottie, father bought a farm on the New Haven River Road in 1972.
I am Molly Otis. I have lived in this house bordering the river for 4 years.
My name is Norman Bushka. I've been here since 1947, and so that's 68 years.
My name is Lawrence Masterson. I'm 75 years old, and I've lived in this area all my life.
Pete Bryan. I live in Bristol and have lived here except for that individual board. I was born in Virginia, but my folks lived in Bristol, so I lived here all my life.
My name is Spencer Llewellyn, and I've lived in Stuttsville, Vermont my entire life, which is close to the New Haven River. I've spent time on the river, fishing, foraging, hunting, exploring throughout my entire life.
My name is Michelle Founts, and I own the property at 87 Riversland Road, which is the Sapphire Center. And I've been here for about 5 years now.
Bill Finger, and I've lived here off and on for 7 years.
So that gives you an introduction into some of the stories that we're going to see over the course of the next 25 minutes or half an hour. And you'll see sort of these themes evolve. We're going to talk about floods and people who've experienced those firsthand, whether it was in 1927 or in 1998. And that'll transition into just experiences with the river, because our identity within this watershed is very much framed around the New Haven River, but it's not just framed around floods, right? It can help us to understand floods and to adapt to floods, but it's also about who we are as people who inhabit this watershed and use it as a resource. So this next one is from Paul Oddie, who you just met. And can you hear the volume okay?
I don't know. You paid pretty close attention to the river. I know one of our neighbors, the first year we were there, my father and I moved. The rest of the family were, kids were still in school and they hadn't moved up yet. And Harold Dash, he stopped, introduced himself to us, and he told us over and over again, he said, you want to watch that river because it comes up real big, real quick. And we had a thunderstorm. And it was maybe when we were just starting to milk, and we finished milking. My father and I went to eat supper, and he went down to the river to fish. And there was a gravel bar there, and the river normally ran on one side of the gravel bar, but not the other. And he heard something, and he looked, and the water was starting to run on the other side of the gravel bar. So he rushed back up, and by the time he got, it was 100 feet or so. It was up over his knees. He came to the house and got me. We went back down, and it was right level full of water. And that was a matter of half an hour. It went from normal to full. So Harold was right. So we always watch the river after that.
He was saying that you have to be careful with how quickly the water rises. And so the local knowledge of people who had been there long before him had warned him of what could happen in a pretty short period of time. And so that was sort of the gist of what he was saying, is that you got to watch it, because most days it looks like just a little brook, but it can raise in power really, really quickly. Yes, exactly.
But if you've never seen it happen, it doesn't mean anything to you. You can tell people what it's going to do, but until it does, it's just a bunch of pictures, and it doesn't mean anything until you hear those boulders, or you see that water taking the bridge away, or a building, and it's and like I said, you go and look at the New Haven River today. No way, it's not going to happen. It's only starting in Lincoln. But like in '98, where it started in Lincoln, up in South Lincoln, there's little brook. I mean, it washed out roads and bridges up there, and you say, how could it get enough water there to do it? But I can see you don't ask a lot of questions. You just know that it might.
And so these gentlemen sort of set the course for what the river can do, and how much power it can carry, and that transitioned into some stories, and you'll see in this image of the watershed that these stories aren't isolated to one town. These are experiences that are shared across the entire watershed. And you'll see as we click through these videos that the location might change. But it's still part of this watershed. And so those two gentlemen sort of set the foundation for these experiences of floods over the last century.
My mother, maiden name was Ruth Kilburn, and her parents and my grandfather's brother owned a grist mill here in town. It's located behind the main street on the south side of Bristol Village. And she was born here in Bristol, right on North Street, 58 North Street. And that family home is still in the family. My sister lives there currently, but my mother was born there in 1921. So she was a young girl when they had the flood in Vermont of 27. And her recollection, according to what she told me, was that it was pretty devastating throughout Vermont, and Bristol was a participant in that. And this comes home to me because I currently own the Village Creamy Stand here in Bristol, which is located on West Street. And at that time, she recalled that the road had eroded out and washed out from the flooding from the New Haven River to the north side of West Street, which took out pretty much the entire bank. And I'm going to guess had to be maybe 100 feet of land that washed out. Subsequently, they reclaimed that land by filling it in with old cars and rubbish and earth, and that's where my creamy stand is currently located. It's been a concern of mine for some time that I explained to the Conservation Commission here in Bristol that that bank is quite unstable because of that. You know, it's reclaimed land and is only underpinned by some rusted cars and some loose earth. So we worry about that.
And this is a picture, thank you to the Bristol Historical Society for this photo, that is taken in 1943. I guess I can't make it any bigger. But this is the bank that Tom is talking about here. And you can see that it's really exposed in this picture and highly susceptible to erosion. And so there's part of this bank is what he's describing when he says that it was reinforced with old cars. And so then jumping ahead, it was only 11 years later when Vermont was hit with another major flood. And here we have another story of a personal experience with that.
And we used to come down here in a horse and buggy. And I can remember when they used to start cars by getting in front of it and winding the motor to get it started, you know. And very few people had cars when I was born, So I can remember a lot of things that were different from what they are now. And I don't think environmental concerns was the last thing we thought about, I think. I grew up in the Depression, we were worried about things to eat, whether or not we were going to have enough to eat. I can remember the flood of 1938, which was a very big flood. Yeah. We lived in Little Ireland, which is a part of Starksville. And I went to the Little Ireland School, which is a one-room school. So I started first grade and went there till a house burned when I was in 6th grade. But I remember there's a little brook there that washed out the bridge, so we had to walk across the brook to get to the school and back. It wasn't that big a deal. I mean, we lived exactly 1 mile. We had to walk 1 mile to the school.
It wasn't a bigger deal today.
No. Well, there were people who lived about a mile below where we lived, so then there was people who burned over. He walked to, he used to come to our meetings occasionally. But he lived a mile below me, so he had to walk 2 miles to school, 2 miles back.
So certainly a different time and different perspectives. He mentioned that environmental concerns were one of the last things that they considered at the time when you don't have food to put on the table. But his experience is not that much different in time when you think about how other people have been affected by rising waters. And so here is also courtesy of the Historical Society here, a picture from that flood of a car being washed away in 1938. And so you can see that this is a long history, and these stories are, these are just a handful of the many that could be told from this watershed and more. And we're going to jump ahead in time to talk about a flood that some of you may remember in 1998. But before we do, I want to bring someone up here who has a very intimate relationship with the river and relies on it to get to and from work and home on a daily basis. And so I'd like to ask Lolly to come up and share one of her, what I can imagine, is many stories. So please welcome Lolly Otis.
Hello, my name is Lolly, and I live up in Lincoln, actually West Lincoln, in a very unique place. And I like to say that I live with the river. In fact, I live behind the New Haven River on the back side. And on some days, I walk through the river to get to wherever I'm going. Like today, I think my feet are a little wet still in my sandals because I chose to walk today. But other days, when the river is higher, and probably more times than not, I leave home or go home via the tram. And some of you may have seen this in West Lincoln. Looks sort of like a trolley, some people call it that, but we have always called it the tram. So there is a steel cable that stretches across the river, and this structure hangs from it. And next to it is a rope that you can see in the picture, and you pull the rope to pull yourself back and forth. So my experience here started in 2012 when I got together with my late husband, who had bought the property 1 year prior. And he had been working away, he said later, to make way for me. But he did the really hardcore time there because he lived in this property for 1 full year with no plumbing. But he was an avid hiker. He had done all 3 of the major cross-country hikes, the AT, the Pacific Crest Trail, and the Continental Divide Trail. So he was very rugged and very determined, and he could handle all this. And I fell in love with him. So thankfully, I fell in love with the property as well, and we started our venture there together in July of 2012. So my story about waters rising is not from the 98 flood, nor from Irene, although my late husband was there during Irene. My story is from April 14th, 2014. And sometimes the river comes up not with a major event, but just a very, very heavy rain, or a rain that goes on for a couple of days. And because we live in Lincoln and all that water is coming down from the mountain and the hills, there is such a compounded effect by the time it gets to River Road. So at this time, I was an assistant for the select board in Lincoln, and it was one of their meeting nights. I would go on Tuesday nights to take minutes, and I would often get finished there at 9:30 or 10 and return home, and my husband would always cross on the tram very gallantly and meet me on the roadside to bring me back. So on this particular day, it had been raining for a couple of days and the river was coming up, and I was over at the bakery and a friend of mine came down and she said, "The river is really coming up. Have you seen it?" And I had been lollygagging around in the bakery, enjoying coffee. It had been a few hours since I'd left home, so I hadn't. And she said, "You be careful." So my plan was to go home, do a quick change of clothes, go out to my meeting. I had a little work to do beforehand, so I was going to go to the town office early. And then after work, my husband would be there to help me get across. So if anything was scary, he would be there. So I left and started to head up into Lincoln. And as soon as I got where I could see the river, I realized, oh my God, I am not even remotely going to think about crossing alone. So it was already making waves, kind of white capping, as it gets for those of you who have seen it. And I decided I would go straight to the town office and I would wait and cross when my husband was with me. So he worked in Middlebury at the college, he was a coach, and I called him probably about 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon. And I had to leave a message, but I said, "I don't know what you're doing and what you have on schedule for the rest of the day, but you better get home sooner rather than later. The river is really coming up. And I'm at the town office, I'll see you later, but you should get home." So meanwhile, I spoke to Bill Finger, who is one of the other speakers on here. He is the select board chairman. And we talked a little bit about it, and I said I might have to leave the meeting early tonight if the river really gets bad. And Bill, who also lives on the river, said, "Lolly, I don't know if it's so much a question of when you cross as if you should cross." And I said, "Well, I've called my husband, he'll know, he's very good under pressure and in emergency situations. I'll let him figure it out." So I was sort of cluelessly getting my stuff ready for the select board meeting, and the door to the town office opened and my husband walked in. And I immediately started telling him how Bill said it was fine if I had to leave early, and I'm rushing around, and all of a sudden I realized that he was very still and he was just staring at me like I had grown another head. And so I stopped chattering for a minute and I looked at him and he said, "Sweetie, you don't understand. We need to go now. This is getting to the point of where it was with Hurricane Irene." And I started to say one other thing, and he said, "We need to go right now." So I quickly called Bill Finger and said, "I'm not going to be at the meeting, we've got to cross." So we leave and we get to the tram, and we both had independently bought a bag of groceries. In my bag there were all kinds of healthy things, lettuce and sprouts and avocado. And in John's bag there was a frozen pizza and a big bag of Tostitos and God knows what else. And the other bag we had was a big kind of canvas bag that I used every day when I went to work to carry my lunch and papers that I needed. And I had taken my laptop out that day. So we got to the river, and it was scary, no doubt about it. But I had John with me, the hiker extraordinaire who had faced all kinds of very challenging situations up in high peaks. And so I completely trusted his judgment. But we were taking it very seriously. And we got to the tram, and we were both kind of, bending over and eyeing the water. And we were trying to make sure that there was enough clearance for the tram to make it over this water that was absolutely at a terrifying level. And all we wanted to do was just get across, and then we were going to hunker down because we have a dog and he was there waiting to be fed, and we just wanted to get home. Once you get to our home on the other side, we're high and dry, we're way up, so it was just getting there. So we eyed it for a little while and both decided that we could make it. So we got on the tram, and at that point, whoever was driving would stand on the back, and then you would kind of give a scooter push off, and that's how you would start. And it would take you almost the whole way across. You would only have to do 1 or 2 poles on the other side. So whoever was holding would hold the bar with one hand, and those last 2 poles were kind of a one-handed thing. Whoever was the passenger was sitting on the front of the tram. So I sat down and we loaded our stuff on. And right before we left, John reached down and took my laptop out of my canvas bag, and he put it in a bag that he had strapped across his shoulder and zipped it up. So he had this strapped around his shoulder. So we were being very solemn and very serious, and we just wanted to get this, 45 seconds over with and be home. And he said, "Are you ready?" And I said, "Yes." And he pushed off. So we made it 3/4 of the way across. And all of a sudden, this tram kind of swayed out to the side a little bit. And I realized that something had gone wrong and something was happening. And I turned to look back and see. And as I turned, the first thing I saw was this big bag of Tostitos bobbing in the waves downriver. And I realized that the whole bag had gone over. And I was getting ready to, maybe give my husband the what for, who knows. But I turned around and realized we were in serious trouble. So what had happened is we had not measured in or factored in the weight of us and the groceries on the tram. So we were almost to the other side when a cresting wave hit the side and washed over it and washed both of the bags, 3 bags, our 2 grocery bags and the canvas bag that I would have had my laptop in, washed it off. But our bigger fear was if the tram sways out too far to the side, it can come off the big pulleys. And if it had done that, we would have been probably 4 to 6 inches under the water, and it would have been very hard to pull through. As soon as I saw that we were in trouble like that, and John had only one hand to try to do those pulls, I turned around and just put my hand on it and started helping with all that I had to just get us to the side. Thankfully, we did make it to the side, and we got off, and I turned around and realized that all of our stuff had gone. And the first thing I did was look up and yell a very serious expletive. And as soon as that was out of my mouth, it hit me. Oh my God, I mean, we could have been in that water. And it was such that there was no question that we could never have gotten out of it. It was flowing with such intense volume, so high, so hard, so fast. And I think it hit both of us at the same time, and we just put our arms around one another and just clung to each other like two drowned rats as it really broke over us that we were very close to having gone out together. So, minus our groceries, we walked up to the house and we were just so grateful to be there, but so shaken up that all we could do was feed our dog, and then we went upstairs and lay in bed. And John, I think, took it very hard because I had grown up with the river. As a child, I lived on a farm, and we had a river that ran through it. And our parents, who did not swim, would tell all of us, 5 children, in the spring, the river is mad, don't go near it. And as a child, we looked at it and it certainly looked mad. And later I thought, how ridiculous that, that's what they told us to keep us away from the river. But then after returning to living near the river, I thought, how masterful that they found a way to keep little kids away from the river. So I sort of had that card in my head that the river can get to places where you don't mess with it. Whereas John, I think because he was so coordinated and he had been through so much and navigated so much, had a little bit of an unrealistic idea that he was strong enough and coordinated enough to handle anything. So this was the real wake-up call for him that there are times that no matter how strong you are, no matter how coordinated, no matter how good of an athlete, you just don't take on the river. So he looked at me very seriously and very earnestly, and he said, we will never do that again, if it's even close to that. Next time, you will go somewhere and spend the night, and I will hike in through York Hill, which is about a half-mile walk through woods, feed the dog, and then I'll come back. And I am so sorry. So since then, I am now alone, and I'm carrying on at the Tram House, as we call it. But my absolute bottom line rule is, when I look at the river, if I am not 100% confident that I could swim out if I go in, I don't leave. So it's a lot of lessons in learning to make do, and certainly learning that I live with the river, not just behind it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lolly. So I had actually originally recorded that story and had some different ideas for this event, but realized that some stories are best told live, and especially when you live so closely with the river like Lolly does. And while she escaped with just a loss of some tortilla chips, sometimes floods can bring more damage, and you risk losing more. And this is a story from Don Gale, who lives up in Lincoln, and his sugar house is also right on the river. And this is his story of the flood of '98. And he has some interesting commentary, so enjoy.
98 flood. We'd had rain for days. And by the time it was all done, I think they said that it was over 8 inches of rain. And the morning that it actually flooded here in Lincoln, it was just coming down in buckets. And that was after days of already, the ground was already saturated with rain. And then it just came down in days, and it was just pouring. And I want to say it was around 2 or maybe 4 o'clock in the morning, somebody pulled up in front of our house and beat the horn. And I got up and you could hear the creek. It was just rhythmic. And I thought, maybe I ought to go down and check on things. And I came down here. The water was already creeping up into the yard here. It was already over that. And you couldn't even see that. And the stuff that was going down the creek, I mean, trees, logs, I mean, and like I said, you could hear the stones just rumbling down through. And it had already surrounded that tree. So I thought, I better start moving stuff. And by the time it was daylight, everything here was in water. And I was grabbing stuff out of my sugar house and either putting it up high or moving it across the street. And it looked like Sanford and Son up there by our house. I had vehicles, I had tanks, sap tanks, I had my, snowmobile. Everything was sitting out, lawnmowers, everything was sitting out in the yard, the neighbor's yard. In fact, the water was coming down the other side of the road so hard that I actually ended up having to move my tanks the second time because the water was getting up to them. And that was the first time, 98. So we had lived here about 10 years. And every time the water came up, it made me nervous. And then that rock, I finally learned not to get nervous until we got over that. But that's the first time we ever had water in our basement of our house. And it just seeped in through the floor and the walls. And got up just shy of the burner on the furnace. So we lucked out there. And I'll never forget, we pumped the cellar out in the fire department. There was a house right next to the firehouse there. And we completely pumped that basement out. And as soon as we shut the pumps off, it was full right to the floor rafters all over again. It was just amazing the amount of water that was moving through the soils. It was just incredible. I don't know, that was definitely a storm to be reckoned with. And this whole yard was just, almost the whole yard was covered with my driveway, what was left of the driveway. And in front of the buildings, and that was true of 98 and the Irene. Right in front of my sugar house, you could park a car and the hole was chewed out in front of the building. It was just incredible. Then the cleanup began. And luckily, I had two neighbors that came over with their tractors and they pulled all the dirt, gravel, and everything that was in my yard. They pulled it back in the driveway. I still ended up having those 2 dump truck loads of gravel to bring back. And the rest of it all went down. Probably down to the lake stream. And the trees that were here, that evergreen and all those maples were completely underwater. You couldn't even see them. They were just bent right over. And it really surprised me that once the water receded, those maples came right back and continued to grow.
So one of the things to note about Don's story and thinking about the geology that we discussed earlier is that he's in sort of a precarious situation, and and this is the case for much of Lincoln, and that on one side of the river it's bordered by bedrock, and so you can think of water hitting bedrock. That rock's not going to go anywhere, and so on the other side, which is where his house is some of that alluvial or soil that's this gravel or these cane terraces that are also gravel and sandy, that's going to give way in the event of high waters. And so kind of jokingly, Don mentioned that, I don't know if you heard it, that his driveway probably ended up in Lake Champlain. And that's a legacy that we have to deal with if we're downstream, and we should deal with it as a community. And of course, many of you know this was quite some storm. And a couple that's here with us today lived on the very opposite side of the watershed. And so I'll zoom out here. This is in New Haven, down in some of those rich agricultural soils, sort of near the confluence with Otter Creek. And you can compare their location, that's the purple 11, to Dawn all the way up here. And really their experiences are only different in the details.
We had the flood in '98.
June 27th.
And the Deer Fire Department in New Haven is just marvelous. And they came and banged on the front door, which no one does in Vermont.
4 o'clock in the morning.
4:30. And woke us up and said we had 20 minutes to get out. We could not go to Bristol. We could only go to Middlebury because the road was already washed over, probably down at Sergeant Cross Road. And so we, being from away and not understanding any of this, called Charlie Lee, the guy we bought the farm from, and said, "So, Charlie, sorry to wake you up, but what's it like when it floods here?" And Charlie says, "No problem. We had a flood, and the barn was an island, and the house was an island, no problem." So, okay. We called the guy next door, Bob Delaney. "Are you leaving?" "No," he says, "we're not." So
we put both cars in the
in the barn, because Charlie told us it was a little higher. And that was about as much preparation as we could do at 4 in the morning on the driving lane. So we sat it out, and the water kept coming. There was a gap in the lilac hedge at the end of our property before it goes on to the next property to the east. And there was a waterfall coming off the road onto our lawn through that. Remember that? That was scary. The water came up, and the water went right back down, and we were out in the yard at 3:30. But you had to wear your muck boots, and you had to walk very carefully because it sucked the boots right off my feet. As the soil there is so wonderful because this happens periodically. It's full of nutrients and loam and rich stuff.
You get the good soil from Lincoln
But it was a mighty awful mess.
The big trees and flotsam and jetsam that comes down the river, cuts across the fields and the lawn, have demolished the cow fences, the heifers, a dozen heifers in there. And the heifers were, at that point, saying to themselves, we're free. And they're prancing all over the lawn. And would you believe that the divots were
every footprint from every cow.
10 inches.
And that was before they put out danced on the bridge, because there were no cars and they could. And so there were cows on the bridge, there were these potholes in the yard. It was just crazy.
The four hills came down and got their heifers after a while.
And maybe that was Don's soil that ended up in your yard down in New Haven. And so we're seeing these parallels in the stories. And something that's really important when we think about flooding in Vermont especially, the case with the Carruthers where they're really just inundated with water and you get this sediment deposited on things and on cropland. That's only a small portion of the damage that we see from flood events in Vermont. And by and large, the most of the damage comes from erosional activities from these rushing waters. And that goes right back to our historical settlement of parts of the river and parts of the landscape. And so when we plan for these events and we think about flooding, we need to think beyond just what happens when water covers our crops or our cars. We need to think about what happens when water cuts the soil out from beneath our feet. And to finish up the theme of 98, Alice Leeds is a former teacher at Lincoln Community School. And she was there in 98 when they were really hit hard with that flood. And so she's going to tell you a little bit about what they did during that time and share a little piece of writing from that time.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Good. Okay, so as Gabe said, I taught in Lincoln for 25 years, up until a couple of years ago. And the school, most of you probably know, it's right on the New Haven, where it just, as Wally pointed out, it rushes down from the New Haven, just above there. And so the students, the kids that come to the school have a really close relationship with the river. And our program is very connected to the river in many ways. They swim and wade and take water samples and study the water life and the plant life along the river, and a lot of things happen around the river. But just one little example came to mind when I was hearing different stories. A few years after I started teaching there, one day my classroom, I was standing in front of the classroom, and there's a window right here looking out on the river, and all of a sudden the whole class just got up and ran to the window, and I kind of heard a rumbling. It was in the spring, early spring, and apparently it was the first time during the school day that the ice had broken up, and it just came gushing down the river, and you could see it. I mean, there's a huge field out to the river, and you could just see the water just dancing up from its, from the body of the river, and all the kids just stood. It was very similar kind of parallels to the first snowfall, and it's just something that they're so attuned to. Just a little example, but this piece that I'm going to read was written by a student in 1998 after the flood, Jessica Leaders Dumont. You may know her parents are Jim Dumont and Karen Leaders. And I just invited the students to write some of their felt impressions about the flood and their experiences. We did the same thing after the 2011 flood, and some really very beautiful writing came out of it. If you're interested in seeing some of, and ultimately we did a lot of oral history, gathered a lot of stories about the floods throughout time. From 27, Patty Brown came and spoke with them, and Pete Domenico, and a number of different people. I just saw Pete, and you'll be seeing him in a moment. And we ultimately put together a little performance piece, and if you're interested, you can get that out of the Lincoln Library. It's called Mud and Water. So we opened the piece that we did, the performance piece, with Jessica's writing, and behind it was a lot of the students created a dance movement piece that expressed what was going on in this piece. It had rained that night. It had rained and poured and drenched things everywhere. If you looked out your window, you would see outlined the powerful yellow lightning, sometimes red, etched against the black sky and the rain. Oh, the horrid dark black, like a raccoon's face, smiling in the dark. Oh, the horrible rain, fast and heavy and huge, like a giant, like an angry giant, scooping up our roads and pushing them under lakes and rivers. Then the thunder, the giant's roar, almost shaking the house. Then another roar, the roar of streams and rivers crashing down and taking away trees and rocks, shoving them at each other, making them crack and split, making everyone realize the power and strength and enormity of our flood, Lincoln's flood of '98, and then making Lincoln small, so small compared to the New Haven River, now a steadily rising brown torrent.
Thank you for that. And so we can see that we're definitely linked by floods. and there's a rich history of that in this area. But I want to transition into a different relationship that doesn't just stem from damage or potential harm that can come from the river, because you can drive any day of the summer and see how rich of a resource it is for recreation and for contemplation and all of these things that will really be brought out in some of these stories that you're about to hear, and how our perceptions have changed through time in how we look at the river, whether it's with flooding or not. And so to start with, there's a little clip from Bill Finger, who you've heard his name a couple of times, and he's lived on the river in Lincoln, just across the border from Bristol, for his whole life, and so he's seen a lot of change in his lifetime, and he discusses that a little bit here.
I think people tend to think that the environmental concerns are relatively recent, or at least people's knowledge of them. And when I was a kid, the sewer from this house, straight pipe from the river. And one of our games that we used to play, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but is we put a whole bunch of toilet paper in the toilet and we'd flush it and see if we could beat it, and when we see it coming out the river down there. But then we'd go ahead and we'd go swimming down at Bartlett Falls, and our parents said, well, it's all purified by the time it gets here. So, but everybody was a straight pipe in the river.
I've come down from different areas, especially up by where my brother lives now, on the way to Lincoln. And you'd walk down fishing along through there, maybe tubing, and you'd see a sewer pipe coming right out from the bank from a house that was off, a ways away, and they would just dump right into the river.
Back in the 50s and 60s, was you didn't swim after a heavy rain, because most of Lincoln's septic was a pipe that ran into the river, so you waited for the river to settle in before you swam.
In the town I grew up in, you walked up the brook and every house was sort of like right directly into the river. And that don't happen anymore. Yeah, and that's the way the world was. Nobody questioned it, and the kids swam in the brook, and I swam in it down there once.
And so, of course, that's not the case today, and we're thankful for that. And perhaps it was still provided for this resource that people used even in the wake of racing toilet paper down the drain or into the river. But you'll hear through some of these stories from residents as far again as New Haven and Lincoln, what the river means to them and how that connects us across this watershed. And so this first one's from Susan Smiley, who is a longtime resident of Lincoln, or excuse me, of New Haven.
I'm very attracted to, personally very attracted to water. I find myself looking at, property all the time, thinking, I'd like to live along here, whether it's beside Lake Champlain or beside Otter Creek or here. Although these days I have then chide myself saying, what do you want to find another place that's probably going to flood and not where you have more where things are perilous because of the way climate is changing. But I'm very grateful that it's here. We use it we haul buckets of water from the river for the garden. We've for a long time when the well went out from the barn, we hauled water to the animal from the river. I would come down here all winter long, hack a hole in the ice, and open it up again and drop the bucket in it and bring it back and haul it up. And it's a pretty steep slope to haul 2 buckets full of water, but. To live on the top of a hill and not have and be in a very different circumstance where there wasn't water close by would feel like deprivation.
So she uses a very strong word there in deprivation, and I think that's true for a lot of people who really rely on it, whether it's for the soils for periodic flooding or for the water for feeding themselves or for quenching their thirst or their livestock. But that transcends generations, and so this is a young kid from this area that is now up at UVM who explains how he has found use of the river in the surrounding landscape.
It was a really great asset to have, having the river right there, and having this place to explore and a lot of river to go along with fish. And go swimming in, bunch of awesome swimming holes. It's probably actually the most I used it before. Yeah, I take a lot of friends with me along the way to go fishing or to go swimming. Some people I even trust with my foraging spots, so I'll bring them along, like my little brother. I've been teaching him a lot about it. I think mainly like just as like asset for people to use in recreation. I think that's the most value that it has. But it's like also it just has like houses all these different communities, like wildlife and fish and insects and birds, and provides all this food that we take from it. I think it's just an all-around great asset to everybody.
And that last line is really important. It's to everybody. And so he describes how he personally uses the river. But if you, as I mentioned, if you drive up Lincoln Road during the summer and you look at some of the traffic, that all these cars are parked to swim in this river that no longer houses sewage pipes that drain straight into it, it kind of speaks to the value of it. And it brings people together within this community, but also from outside the community. But it seems through a lot of these stories, and we won't get to all of them today, we're going to finish with just a couple more short ones, that these stories go beyond a value that you can really describe in terms of recreation or of monetary value. And this comes from, first from a woman who ran an autistic center for young kids and utilized the river for really a therapeutic purpose that she puts into words really elegantly, but I think it's difficult to really grasp without witnessing it.
For about 4 years, this property has served as a therapeutic early childhood center, specializing in working with children on the autism spectrum or children with other significant developmental challenges. And during the time that we were operating as a center, we regularly brought the kids down to the river to play, especially on hot summer days. And all of the kids, once they learned what that experience was all about, and novelty or uncertainty was worked through, I don't think we ever had a child that said no to go to the river. It was always a favorite activity for the adults as well as the children. People associate a lot of water play for children on the spectrum. It's something that is often very calming and very therapeutic for kids. I think most all kids enjoy being in water, but especially there's something about water for children on the spectrum that is often very powerful. Many of the kids, we could see a significant change in their overall mood and level of engagement and their interest in social connections after they have been able to spend an hour or two splashing in the water, throwing rocks in the water, running around, with their shoes off, digging in the sand. There's an intense sensory experience to playing at the river.
And I think that I'm sure that goes back to deep in our roots as we evolve as a species. We're all attracted to water, generally speaking, and Michelle really talks about how that the ability to access this clean resource affects kids who might not otherwise have that opportunity. And so for my last story, unfortunately Pete's not here today, but Pete, he tells us about how the river changed his life in a time of ill health.
In a personal experience, this water and this river is more than anything people realize. This is my life. This is who I am, really. I mean, I had a major illness. I had hepatitis C for 60 weeks. I had liver cancer, and that took half my liver out. I barely could put one foot in front of the other. But I made it a point in that 60 weeks, every day. I may have missed a few, but not many. Every day I went down to the river. I drove down 4 miles from my house to the New River to my famous pool I call my thinking pool. I could hear the water tumbling. There's a confluence there following the river. And it's cords to go through there. So for heating, I sat there every day for 30 minutes. I can't tell you what this river did for me, except I think it really saved my life. It put me in such a good spot. I mean, looking back, I don't know how I got through it, but I did, and this river was a big part of it. And it consoles me, it makes me feel good, it makes me feel happy. It's just a common effect, just listen to water. And if I've had a bad day, I come down to the river. Some people do it other ways. I come down the river and just sit there. And boy, it's all better in not too short time.
So I'm sorry if that was a little bit hard to hear, but really, a river as a healing place. And Pete is a strong advocate for the health of the New Haven and monitors and posts updates on E. coli that I've been down to Bartlett's Falls or to other places and watched people look at these signs and have conversations with them. And one of the most common answers to, do you think the river is clean, is it's a lot cleaner than Lake Champlain. And this is a lot of folks that are coming from Burlington and Chittenden County. So the river certainly serves as this resource to bring folks in and as I mentioned, to connect people together. Reg Dearborn, who you heard from earlier, said that in talking about floods, he said, sometimes the dates are the only thing that's different in the news. And I found that statement ring really true to these stories as well, not to just to flood stories, but to experiences in general. And you go back to 1830 and you can hear a story of the old Nash farm, which is where the brothers lived. And in 1830, it was one of the biggest floods known in Vermont history in this area. And Mrs. Nash was severely pregnant, and the New Haven overflowed, and it came onto the first floor and came into the birthing room. And so she had to go upstairs to give birth to her son during this flood, who she aptly named Noah Preserved Nash. But you can go back to the flood in 27, and Bristol residents would tell you about caskets floating down the river, where you could go into 2004 and hear elementary students describe water rushing down the mountainside and meeting the front door of their school. But as I mentioned, it's not just news and stories of floods. These experiences also haven't changed except for the date. Go back 3,000 years and Native Americans fished the same clear waters that Pete or others have fished today, that Spencer forages from the banks. Undoubtedly, they enjoyed the same waters to cool off during the summers as many of us do today. The earliest settlers felled trees to power industry and build homes and build communities. And it's the same forest, though they're younger today, that we rely on for business, for recreation, and for warmth. So the kinds of stories that we tell in the future will depend on how we shape the river and how it continues to shape us. But one thing that remains inescapable is that we are bound by this watershed and this river, and it crosses these town boundaries that we've drawn on maps. And I think it's important to realize that we are connected across the scale of this river and of this watershed, and really make decisions based on that. Thank you.